In 2024, a record was broken in Canada. Not a hockey record, not a GDP milestone, not something anyone wanted to celebrate with fireworks or a flag-raising ceremony. 106,134 people. That is the number of Canadian citizens and permanent residents who packed their lives into boxes, said goodbye to their friends, and left Canada for good in 2024, according to Statistics Canada. Not tourists, not students on exchange. Gone. Permanently. To understand how extraordinary this number is, consider that in 2019, before the housing crisis hit critical mass, before the pandemic, before inflation ran riot, only around 90,500 Canadians emigrated permanently. That means within 5 years, the number of people choosing to leave Canada forever surged by more than 17%. And the acceleration is not slowing down. The latest quarterly StatsCan figures from Q3 of 2025 already show 41,203 people departing in a single quarter, a pace that implies another year at or above 105,000 permanent departures. Canada has long sold itself on a promise. Come for the clean air, the healthcare, the civility, and above all, the opportunity. For decades, that promise was honored. But something has fundamentally broken. And today we are going to follow the data, the dollars, and the departures, all the way to the uncomfortable truth. This is the Great Canadian Exodus, and it may only be getting started. But who exactly is leaving, and why are the people Canada can least afford to lose the ones walking out the door first? Let us start with the raw data, because the data is shocking enough without any embellishment. Statistics Canada publishes what are called quarterly international migration tables. These are not soft estimates or survey approximations. They are administrative counts of Canadians and permanent residents who have formally deregistered, filed departure taxes, or otherwise been recorded as having relocated permanently abroad. In 2019, the pre-crisis baseline year, approximately 90,500 to 92,000 people left Canada permanently. This had been relatively stable for years, a slow, unremarkable background hum of normal life churn. By 2023, that number had jumped to 103,200, already up 14% from 2019. Economists and demographers took note. Some framed it as a blip, a post-pandemic readjustment, a temporary anomaly. Then 2024 arrived, and the blip became a record. 106,134 permanent residents and citizens left Canada, the highest emigration figure since 1967. That is not a coincidence or a rounding error. That is a seismic shift in the social and economic contract between a country and its people. Now the Canadian government will, and does, point out that on the gross immigration side, Canada admitted 483,591 permanent residents in 2024. The net migration figure is still positive. Canada is, technically, still growing. But this framing obscures a critical and deeply uncomfortable truth. The people arriving and the people leaving are not interchangeable human units. They represent vastly different skill profiles, economic trajectories, and social contributions. And the specific segment of Canadians who are leaving, they are by almost every measurable standard the ones the country can least afford to lose. The Q3 2025 quarterly figures are particularly alarming. StatsCan's migration monitoring tool shows 41,203 permanent departures in that quarter alone, up sharply from previous quarters. If that pace holds through the full year, 2025 will approach or match the 2024 record, making back-to-back historic highs the new baseline rather than the exception. And beyond the permanent emigrant numbers, consider the parallel surge in what StatsCan calls non-permanent resident outflows. Students and temporary workers whose permits expire and who choose not to apply for permanent residency or simply leave before they have to. In 2022, that number was roughly 408,722. By 2024, it had exploded to 745,306, an 82% surge in people on temporary pathways deciding that Canada's path to permanence was either unavailable, unaffordable, or simply not worth it. The bucket is leaking, and the cracks are getting wider. But to understand why the bucket is leaking, We need to understand who is walking out, because the demographics of departure tell a story that should alarm every Canadian politician, every bank economist, and every pension fund manager in this country. The Great Canadian Exodus is not evenly distributed across the population. It is not retirees cashing out and moving to Mexico. It is not teenagers running away from home. The data from Statistics Canada, U.S. immigration authorities, and independent demographic researchers all converge on a single devastating finding. The people leaving Canada at the highest rates are educated, skilled, working-age professionals between 25 and 45 years old. A 2025 analysis published through StatsCan-linked research on emigration in Canada and brain drain confirmed what many had suspected. Canadian citizen professionals moving to the United States are disproportionately clustered in computer science, mathematics, engineering, finance, and management occupations. These are not people who washed out of the economy. These are people who succeeded, and then looked across the border and did the math. The most concrete evidence for this professional exodus comes from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, the USCIS. Under the USMCA trade agreement, formerly NAFTA, Canadian professionals can enter the United States on what's called a TN visa, a streamlined pathway specifically for engineers, accountants, computer scientists, nurses, and dozens of other designated professional categories. It requires no lottery, no cap, just a credential, a job offer, and a decision to leave. In the first half of 2024, approximately 6,710 TN petitions were filed by Canadian professionals. By the first half of 2025, that number had surged to 9,040, a year-over-year jump of 34.7%. And because TN approval rates hover between 93 and 95%, almost all of these are successful placements. Real people, real jobs, real departures. The TN visa has become, in practical terms, Canada's most efficient talent export mechanism. The compounding tragedy is that many of these professionals are not even Canadian-born. Canadian census data shows that nearly 60% of working-age immigrants, those between 25 and 64, hold a bachelor's degree or higher. Canada attracts educated people from around the world with the promise of opportunity and quality of life. Then a significant portion of those same people, after navigating years of credential recognition battles, underemployment, and housing sticker shock, conclude that the Canadian system is broken, and they leave again, often for the United States. The ICC Immigration Leaky Bucket report quantifies this pattern with uncomfortable precision. Highly educated immigrants, those with engineering degrees, ICT credentials, and management qualifications, leave at roughly twice the rate of lower-skilled migrants. The key trigger? Unemployment or underemployment in the early years after landing. Canada brings in a software engineer from India or a doctor from Nigeria, fails to integrate them into their actual field within 18 to 24 months, and then watches them pack up and head to Seattle or Dallas, where their credentials are recognized and their skills are compensated. Canada is, in the starkest economic terms, subsidizing other countries' talent pipelines. Canadian and provincial governments spend billions on universities, healthcare training, and immigration integration programs, and then a growing share of those graduates and newcomers make a perfectly rational decision to deliver their economic contributions not to Canada, but to the United States, Australia, or the United Kingdom. But to understand why this rational decision is being made in record numbers, we have to look at the single most brutal data set in this entire documentary: the math of actually living in Canada's major cities. Let me walk you through the math that is driving hundreds of thousands of Canadians to the airport. Not political rhetoric, not vibes, pure, brutal arithmetic. Consider a couple in Toronto, combined gross household income of 100,000 Canadian dollars, which by Statistics Canada's own 2023 median household income data puts them solidly in the middle class. Not rich, not struggling in theory, just normal. After federal and provincial income taxes, CPP contributions, and EI premiums, that $100,000 gross salary becomes approximately $65,000 to $70,000 in take-home pay. Already, before a single dollar is spent on rent, food, or transit, a third of their income has been consumed. Now they need somewhere to live. The median home price in the Greater Toronto Area in 2024 ran between 1.15 million Canadian dollars and 1.20 million Canadian dollars, depending on the month and the specific submarket. To purchase that median home with a 20% down payment, the minimum required to avoid default mortgage insurance, they need to save 236,000 Canadian dollars. At a savings rate of 20% of their net income, roughly $13,600 per year, that down payment takes over 17 years to accumulate. And that calculation assumes home prices do not rise by a single dollar during that 17-year period, a mathematical fiction that bears no relationship to Toronto's historical price trajectory. But of course, they are not saving 20%, because they also need to pay rent. The median two-bedroom apartment in central Toronto in 2024 ran between 2,800 Canadian dollars and 3,200 Canadian dollars per month. Let's use $3,000 as a round number. That is $36,000 per year, representing between 51 and 55% of their take-home income, spent entirely on keeping a roof overhead. What remains, perhaps $32,000 annually, must cover groceries, childcare, transportation, utilities, retirement savings, and everything else that constitutes a functioning middle-class life. Vancouver is worse. The median home price in Metro Vancouver in 2024 reached 1.25 to 1.30 million Canadian dollars. Two-bedroom rents in core areas hit 3,200 to 3,600 Canadian dollars per month. At a $3,400 monthly average, a family on a $100,000 income is spending $40,800 per year, or approximately 60% of their net income, on housing alone. The remaining $27,000 must stretch across every other category of human need. Now transport that same Canadian couple to Austin, Texas. The median household income in Austin in 2024 was approximately $95,000 US, roughly equivalent to 130,000 Canadian dollars at current exchange rates, meaning the same caliber of professional earns meaningfully more in USD terms. The median home price in Austin? USD $480,000 to $500,000, approximately CAD $660,000 to $690,000. That is 40 to 50% less than a comparable Toronto home. The median two-bedroom rent in Austin ran between $1,800 and $2,200, often lower than Toronto for a substantially larger unit. In Austin, a Canadian caliber professional earning 100,000 Canadian dollars in USD equivalent purchasing power can afford a reasonable mortgage, fund a retirement account, take a vacation, and still have 20 to 30% of their net income left over for discretionary spending. In Toronto or Vancouver, that same person is cash-strapped within 12 to 18 months of trying to build any form of financial stability. The math does not just favor leaving, it screams at people to leave. But the income versus housing equation is only half the story. Because even if you somehow solve the housing problem, the Canadian state has its hand in your pocket in ways that most Canadians have never fully quantified, until now. Beyond the housing crisis, Canadian middle-class families face what economists at the Fraser Institute have called a triple squeeze: a simultaneous compression from income taxes, carbon-linked energy costs, and accelerating inflation on essential goods. Any one of these alone would be manageable. Together, they are financially suffocating. The Fraser Institute's 2024 Canada's Tax Window report modeled the total tax burden, income, payroll, consumption, property, and every other levy, on an average two-income, two-child family earning roughly 150,000 Canadian dollars. Their conclusion: this family pays approximately 60,000 to 65,000 Canadian dollars in total taxes annually, representing 40 to 43% of their income. Between 2019 and 2024, that effective tax share rose by 1.5 to 2 percentage points due to bracket creep and higher provincial healthcare levies. Then add the carbon tax, formerly the federal carbon pricing mechanism, which rose from 40 Canadian dollars per ton in 2021 to 170 Canadian dollars per ton by 2025. This is not an abstract environmental policy instrument when you are filling a gas tank, paying a home heating bill, or receiving an electricity statement. The Conference Board of Canada and the Fraser Institute both model this carbon pricing and its pass-through effects as adding 2,000 to 3,000 Canadian dollars per year to the average household's combined energy and transportation costs, depending on province and vehicle usage. The grocery story is equally alarming. Between 2019 and 2024, Canadian food prices rose approximately 30 to 40% in aggregate, a rate of inflation that dramatically outpaced wage growth, which averaged only 15 to 20% over the same period. Walk into a Toronto Loblaws or a Vancouver Save-On Foods today versus 5 years ago, and you will find the average weekly grocery bill for a family of 4 has increased by hundreds of dollars annually. The OECD's 2024 International Migration Outlook specifically flags Canada's declining real living standards as a driver of outmigration patterns. And then there are utilities. In Ontario and British Columbia, typical monthly residential electricity bills for a family-sized home rose from approximately 120 Canadian dollars to 140 Canadian dollars in 2020 to 180 Canadian dollars to 220 Canadian dollars in 2024, a 40 to 57% increase, driven by higher distribution system charges and carbon-linked fees. Heating costs have climbed in parallel across most provinces that rely on natural gas. The cumulative effect of these simultaneous pressures on groceries, utilities, energy, and taxes has been devastating to real disposable income. Statistics. Canada's own labor income and prices data confirms the punchline. Real disposable income growth for middle-income families has turned negative in several provinces since 2022, even as headline GDP continues to grow. The economy is technically expanding while the average Canadian family's purchasing power is contracting. This is not a perception problem. This is a structural reality, and an increasing number of middle-class Canadians are voting with their feet. But here is the part that truly breaks the traditional Canadian narrative wide open. It is not just born and raised Canadians who are abandoning ship. The very immigrants who came to build a better life are now packing up and leaving too. And their story is perhaps the most damning indictment of all. For decades, Canada's immigration policy was considered one of the most successful in the world. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Recruit the world's skilled workers, offer them a pathway to permanence, integrate them into the economy, watch them build businesses, raise families, and pay taxes for 40 years. Canada's multicultural brand was not just marketing. It was a competitive economic strategy. But the data now tells a different story. Statistics Canada's longitudinal immigration database, the most comprehensive tracking system for immigrant outcomes in the country, published findings in 2024 that should have generated wall-to-wall coverage. Approximately 1 in 5 immigrants leaves Canada within roughly 25 years of landing, and the departure rate is highest in the first 5 years. Precisely the window when economic integration is most fragile, when credential recognition battles are most bruising, and when the gap between the dream and the reality is most visible. The ICC Immigration Leaky Bucket Analysis provides the occupational breakdown. Atlantic Canada, British Columbia, and Quebec have the lowest long-term retention rates for skilled immigrants. In British Columbia and Ontario, the two provinces that receive the majority of skilled immigrants and that command the highest housing costs, large numbers of newcomers are departing to the United States or returning to their countries of origin. The irony is stunning. Canada competes globally for talent, wins the recruitment battle, and then loses the retention war to its own cost of living crisis. StatsCan's internal migration data for immigrants reveals an even more telling detail. Toronto and Montreal have both registered negative net internal migration for some landing year cohorts. Specifically, immigrants who arrived in 2017 and 2018, in the years before the housing crisis fully metastasized, show more departures from those cities over a 5-year window than new arrivals within the same cohort. The cities that were supposed to be the promised lands of Canadian newcomer integration are now net exporters of the very people they spent resources to attract. And then there is the non-permanent resident story, which may be the most telling indicator of all. Canada's immigration system runs on a pathway model. International students and temporary foreign workers are supposed to accumulate points and transition to permanent residency. It is the engine of Canadian population growth. But StatsCan's 2025 migration component data shows that non-permanent resident outflows, people leaving before converting to permanents, exploded from 408,722 in 2022 to 745,306 in 2024, an 82% surge in 2 years. What does an 82% surge in temporary resident departures tell us? It tells us that Canada's promise of come on a work permit, build your life, earn permanent residency is breaking down in real time. International students are graduating into a job market that cannot absorb them. Temporary workers are completing contracts and choosing not to stay. The Canadian immigration pathway, once one of the world's most efficient talent-to-citizen pipelines, is leaking from every joint. The human cost of this is incalculable for the individuals who made enormous sacrifices to get here and found the system couldn't deliver on its promises. But the economic cost for Canada is also deeply concrete. Every immigrant who leaves within 5 years represents a failed return on the immigration and integration investment. Every skilled professional who converts their Canadian education and credential recognition into a USTN visa is a net transfer of human capital from the Canadian economy to the American one. Canada is not just hemorrhaging people, it is subsidizing the economic growth of its competitors. Which brings us to the final and most critical chapter of this documentary: the economic fallout. What do Canada's own economists, bank executives, and demographic researchers say is coming? Spoiler: the language they use is not reassuring. When the people whose job it is to model Canada's economic future start using words like macroeconomic risk and productivity crisis, it is worth paying close attention. Because the brain drain and the emigration surge are not just social stories. They are fiscal time bombs embedded in the foundations of Canada's tax base, healthcare system, and long-term productivity growth. If Canada is not only attracting but also losing a growing share of skilled professionals, the long-term impact on productivity and corporate investment will be felt for years. The cost of living in Canada's big cities is not just a social issue, it's a macroeconomic risk. Benjamin Tal, Deputy Chief Economist, CIBC Capital Markets, 2025. Benjamin Tal's framing cuts to the heart of the issue. Productivity, output per worker, is the single most important driver of long-term living standards. When a country consistently exports its most productive workers to competitors while struggling to retain the immigrants it recruits specifically for their skills, its productivity growth ceiling drops year by year. Canada has already been flagged by the OECD as one of the developed world's laggards in business investment and productivity growth. The immigration crisis is not the cause of that, but it is a powerful accelerant. The tax base implications are equally sobering. The Canadian federal and provincial governments depend heavily on income tax revenues from working-age, high-earning professionals, precisely the demographic that is leaving at the fastest rate. Every engineer who moves to Seattle, every tech worker who takes a TN visa to California, every nurse who relocates to Houston represents not just a lost income stream, but a multi-decade compounded loss. 30 to 40 years of income taxes, healthcare premiums, property taxes, CPP contributions, and consumer spending that will now flow to the United States instead of Canada. Multiply that by 106,000 annual departures, skewed heavily toward the 25 to 45 professional cohort, and the compounding fiscal math becomes staggering. This is not a problem for 2040. The early symptoms: talent shortages in healthcare, technology, and engineering. Slowing productivity metrics, weakening business investment, are already visible in the current data. The emigration numbers are the leading indicator. The economic damage is the lagging one. Demographic researchers studying these patterns have flagged one further risk that tends to be underappreciated: the social contagion effect of emigration. When professionals in a given field, medicine, software development, academia, see their colleagues successfully relocate and report dramatically better financial outcomes, the decision to leave becomes normalized within professional networks. What begins as individual rational choices aggregates into a cultural shift where leaving Canada is no longer the exception. Thank you for watching this full breakdown. Every single statistic, building sale, and report mentioned in this video is linked down in the description below, so you can verify the numbers yourself. If you work downtown, or if you completely disagree with my analysis, let me know in the comments. I read them all. Make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the global economy and real estate market. See you in the next one.